All right, welcome back, everyone, to our lecture, Gods and Men. This is part four, second half. The Greeks invent politics. Now, just to get our bearings here and establish what I like to call context, we're looking here at the historical development of politics among the Greeks during the 5th century BCE, that is the 400s BCE, which is roughly the same time as the developments we looked at in the previous part, or the first half of part four of this lecture, on the Chinese and, for example, the teachings of Confucius. So if you want to think of it as being a kind of contemporary development in Eurasia, one in China, one to the west, the far west in the Mediterranean among the Greeks, you could almost say that Confucius and Socrates would have been classmates. Well, that's not quite right, but it's contemporary enough for our purposes to match them in our minds. That is, two great intellectual teachings now on the subject of good government and politics, one of them in China, one of them among the Greeks, as I say, in the ancient Mediterranean world. Among the ancient Greeks, the search for truth also required careful examination of the fundamental claims and philosophical precepts upon which those who governed justified their power. What the Greeks had in mind, however, was not an appeal to the gods for this examination, that is, for the justification of rule, but among their own philosophical precepts and understandings of politics itself. As the Athenian leader Pericles said, we do not need the praises of a Homer or of anyone else whose words may delight us for the moment, but whose estimation of facts will fall short of what is really true. And what Pericles meant there is, in saying the praises of Homer, remember, Homer was the great poet of mythology, of Greek mythology. And so Pericles is saying we need not appeal to myth for understanding the basis of government. We can examine those fundamental principles with our own unaided reason, without the need to appeal to the gods, if you will. And so, like Confucius, the Greek philosopher Socrates looked for truth in the correct moral behavior of mortals, not in the stories of mythology and gods. So what we're looking at here is not the development of a religion, because you recall that religion meant an appeal to the supernatural. We're here talking now about philosophy, specifically political philosophy, with its appeal to man's ability to reason. There's an image of the philosopher Socrates. We only know what he might have looked like, of course, because of certain descriptions that were left behind, mostly those of his student Plato, the other famous Greek philosopher of this particular 5th century age. Plato was a kind of student, you might say, of Socrates. Socrates was not a formal instructor or professor of any kind. He was a citizen of Athens who gathered around him those who wished to know more about his particular ideas on ethical behavior and politics, one of whom was Plato, who will then essentially create the record of Socrates' teachings. Remember, we said that in the case of these great figures, whether it be the Buddha in northern India, or let's say the Persian prophet Zarathustra, or the Chinese philosopher Confucius, that in the case of Socrates as well, we will see a tradition of teachings come down from those who were in effect students of or otherwise followers of the teachers themselves. So in Socrates' case, again, it's the Greek philosopher Plato who will do the most to, in effect, record and disseminate the teachings of Socrates. Now, before we come back to Socrates, let's take a look at the context here of the Eastern Mediterranean. You guys have done a map on this. You see the Aegean Sea, which is this particular branch of the Eastern Mediterranean here that includes the lands of Greece, including the many Greek isles, which the map also shows. We had looked, for example, at the case of Thera, which is right here, nowadays known as Santorini. Thera was the Greek isle that was devastated by a volcanic explosion near the end of the Bronze Age, which did much to destroy the Minoan civilization of the time. The Minoans were based on the island of Crete here, but also among some of the Greek isles, including Thera. Well, fast forward from the Bronze Age now about 600 or 700 years to the time of Socrates and Plato, that is the 5th century, in which Greece now has undergone a pretty radical transformation from its Bronze Age history, although in enjoying now in the 5th century a kind of renaissance, a Greek renaissance, we still see a great sort of amount of attention given over to the affairs of daily life. You might remember that when we looked at the Minoans, they were celebrators of daily life, of living, in effect, with their great frescoes and wall murals, their adulation of physical beauty, their love of sports and games and that sort of thing. So this Mediterranean culture will see that tradition carried on now in the time of Socrates and the Iron Age, the age of the New Greeks, if you will, who likewise find themselves concerned with and fascinated with the things of this world and this life. They experimented with various forms of governing, including those we still recognize today: monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, tyranny, and finally democracy. It will be in Athens, the home of Socrates, where democracy takes the deepest roots as a kind of political experiment. Now, the reason this goes with this kind of Greek tradition is that politics for the Greeks was something that dealt with the affairs of this world, of this life. In fact, the word itself, politics, comes from the Greek word polis. And you might recall that the polis was the city-state or settlement of a particular area, a particular town that defined a particular form of governing and obedience and loyalty. So Athens, for example, was one such polis. Now, the word meant literally polis, the actions, or politics, I should say, meant the actions of the polis. So that which concerned the people of a particular settlement or polis, that became ultimately the politics of that polis. That is, the affairs of that polis that saw attempts to regulate or coordinate or govern the day-to-day affairs of the people themselves. So our very word politics comes then from the business or the actions of the Greek polis. And given the lay of the land, I mean, the reason you have so many different settlements is because, like on other cases we've looked at, the Greeks lived in this sort of volcanic landscape given over to earthquakes and such, a mountainous region, and it was only in the nooks and crannies, the broader valleys or plains of this region. If you think of the Greek mainland here as being an extension of the Balkan mountain range, which runs to the north into Europe, then you realize that settlement was only possible in those areas, that allowed for a kind of spreading out, you might say. So again, the plains and valleys and fertile lands that allowed for farming in between the mountains, in between the great peaks And so dotted with this landscape. And then, of course, in the sea itself, dotted with islands where settlement and habitation occurred, and where, therefore, a polis could be established. The business of the polis was itself, as I say, a key concern of the Greeks. It was something that the Greeks shared in, the various forms of government that might rule over a particular settlement. And for a guy like Socrates, living now in 5th century Athens, it was perhaps the chief philosophical concern of his city-state, of his polis, arising from the civic life of the Greek polis. You're talking now about a Mediterranean climate that allowed for warm weather for much of the years, a moderate climate, not terribly unlike California, where for much of the year people could be outside, and outdoor markets and gathering places and theaters. They could hear music and trade goods. They could enjoy a kind of social connection with one another, including a gathering, let's say, in the city square, usually a place where various kinds of commerce occurred. Maybe farmers would bring their produce from the outlying regions. Maybe manufacturers within the polis would trade finished goods. And typically a place like Athens, that is a polis like Athens, would have that kind of gathering place, that kind of public square. The Greek word for that was agora, the agora, a marketplace where people could gather. More than just a place to shop, however, the agora was a place for socializing and conversation, exchange of ideas, a place for discussing politics, if you were so inclined. And by the 400s, Athens was the most powerful of the Greek city-states. By powerful, I mean both militarily and financially strong. Sitting on the mainland now, Athens had developed a tradition by the 400s, that is by the 5th century, a tradition of what was called democracy, or what we call democracy. The word itself comes from the Greek word demes, meaning the local neighborhoods of Athens in this case. The demes were the regions of the city-state of the polis, the neighborhoods of the polis, where people had certain connected interests, maybe family interests, maybe they had history together, and they defined themselves as a kind of unique area within the larger settlement. Well, in time, it was a system of government that would bring together the free male citizens of the city-state. And by citizen, I mean a free white male person of a certain age who would take responsibility for representing his deme by attending the business, the political business of the Greek assembly. With the demes represented, then this form of democracy took over the main business of governing Athens for much of the 5th century. In fact, it really is initiated, this period, this classic period of Athenian democracy, with a military victory over their rival Persia, the great empire of Persia, which on 2 occasions attempted to subjugate the Greeks. It was the Greeks' victory over Persia in 479 BCE that opened the door to a golden age of Greek democracy in Athens. Pericles was the leader of Athens during this period, who won support of the masses for promoting democracy. Now, Pericles had been a military leader. But as a military leader, he supported the idea of shared governance and democracy. And as I say, it would be those free white males from each of the demes that would come to the open-air assembly, which the Greeks called the ecclesia, the open air assembly where 40 times a year they would meet to discuss and decide the basic affairs of the city-state. And so it was this new form of government, this shared government, this direct government led by the men of the demes who would then constitute, in effect, the governing authority of Athens. Now, note, we use the word democracy and we tend to have an inclusive sense of it. But as we'll see, who was not included in Greek democracy? Well, it was a male affair, so no women. It was a free person's government, so no one who was enslaved. And about 15 to 20% of the Athenian population at any given time was made up of those enslaved. It was free white males, typically from their neighborhoods or their demes, who were regarded as being trustworthy leaders then. It was not necessarily the case that each and every free white male, but rather those selected by the demes to do the business of the ecclesia. But it was their frequency of meeting that also made it a kind of responsive government, you might say. Because if you had a grievance or you had a suggestion, a proposal for the assembly, you wouldn't have to wait too long. It was a frequently constituted assembly, you might say, in which these matters could be hashed out on the reg. Here's an image, a statuary image of Pericles himself, who becomes, I guess you might say, the kind of symbolic figurehead of Athenian democracy of the 5th century. Now, it was Pericles as the kind of, foremost figure of Athenian democracy who ordered a massive rebuilding and makeover for Athens itself following the victory over Persia. And he brought in artists and architects and builders and masons to begin this project of beautifying the city. Here you see an artist's scale model of what would be one of the crowning achievements now of the Periclean rebuild of Athens. You see on the city map here, again, the familiar kind of landscape of hills and, and the very uneven kind of topography of the Greek mainland. In every polis, there was a high point known as an acropolis. That word meant the high point of the polis, the acropolis or acropolis. And often, in the early days, it could have been used for defensive fortification, say a high ground to protect yourself against marauders and invaders. But as city-states like Athens became more settled, more powerful, better governed, they could afford to think beyond pure defensive needs and think like Pericles had, of representing some aesthetic or ideal of beauty. And it was on top of that Acropolis then, a kind of crowning achievement of Pericles' rebuild of Athens, you might say, that we get the famous architecture of the Parthenon, the great temple dedicated to the Athenian goddess Athena, for whom the city is named. What I would prefer, said Pericles, is that you should fix your eyes every day on the greatness of Athens as she really is, and should fall in love with her. So this is quite a statement now from the Athenian leader Pericles, the leader of the Athenian assembly and democracy, who wanted now this feeling of triumph, this defeat of the Persian Empire, this coming into her own of the Athenian polis, to be reflected in the public architecture, the gorgeous templed, columned temples and sort of landmarks now of the great beautification. You see here, whereas the Acropolis was up high, a place for purely contemplative purposes, you might say, the worship of the gods of Athens, then down here below, make your way down from the Acropolis down to the flat. down to the community center, if you will, of Athens, and the agora, that outdoor marketplace, gathering place of the day-to-day business. So yeah, one represented a kind of high and transcendent ideal of the city-state. The other, the agora, represented its hands-on, day-to-day exchange of, well, everyday life. Athens now had some of the most beautiful buildings and monuments ever designed and built. You can visit their relics and ruins today. You can see just here from this picture from below the Acropolis of the corner, the famous Parthenon that represents this classic age now of Greek architecture. But from 432 to 404 BC, Athens gets bogged down in another costly and destructive war. Only about 30 years after Persia had been defeated by the Greeks, the Athenians now will become involved in the Peloponnesian War. And this was an all-Greek war this time, as powerful city-states like Athens and Sparta and their various allies become entangled in an ongoing and draining military conflict known as the Peloponnesian War. And it's Socrates who lives right at this moment. His dates you see there, 469 to 399. Socrates, who lives right at this decisive moment, is among those who questions the wisdom of the Peloponnesian War, and particularly the part taken by the leaders of Athens. Let me suggest here that what's going to happen is that for Socrates, this represents a great squandering of the influence, hard-won influence of Athens in the defeat of Persia, a squandering of her wealth and her riches. Athens was one of the leading trade cities among the Greek city-states, and a squandering ultimately of her democracy. That is, for Socrates, the Peloponnesian War was a fool's errand. It was more about pride and greed, infighting among the Greeks than it was of any tangible good. And he thought that it had a kind of corrupting influence on Athenian democracy. So for Socrates, the ability to question the course of events, to question the leaders of Athens, the great authorities such as Pericles, was at the very heart of the civic responsibility of every concerned citizen. The point was to remove the business of government, the ethics of the city-state, and morality of day-to-day life from the realm of authority, superstition, and myth. In other words, when there were questions to ask, those questions should be posed directly to the political leaders, and they should be given, the people that is, should be given straight answers to the issues that concerned them. But that idea of questioning authority was probably more favorable in a kind of abstract way. That is, in theory, a democracy was a type of government in which the citizens had the right to make policy, they had the right to debate, they had the right to question. But now in wartime, that right becomes more theoretical, because what Socrates is going to find is that the leaders of Athens, particularly those who are connected with the military and the military policy of the Peloponnesian War, they won't want to be questioned so much. And they will try to frame questioning, let alone criticism, as a kind of unpopular and unpatriotic enterprise, as if in times of war there should be no questioning. But for Socrates, that was nonsense. It was in times of strife and times of tension that free and open debate was most necessary. And it was through dialogue that this better course would be arrived at. That is, from free individuals speaking openly with each other, what the Greeks called dialogue, in other words, that we might call debate. That it was through that process that genuine knowledge and true justice could be arrived at. Socrates forced individuals to examine their assumptions and their biases. Now, keep in mind, Socrates by day, when he works, he's a mason, right? But on any given day, you might find Socrates down in the agora, not so much working as engaging in these conversations. It's sometimes said that he was a gadfly, that is, someone who existed only to irritate power, to question power. Well, it's true that he was active in the business of the polis, not in the assembly, by the way. I mean, his preferred court was the agora, the public marketplace, where he might engage individuals, particularly often young Athenians who saw their fortunes as tied with the success of the Athenian city-state. So he was a kind of teacher on the move, you might say, a debater, an arguer, a conversationalist, a provoker. I mean, whatever he could do to get people talking and thinking about the business of the city-state. He believed ultimately that it wasn't from authority that knowledge and truth comes. Authority often acted as a kind of screen, you might say, to justify this or that policy. But that wasn't therefore to be assumed that it was the same as truth, that is, authority and truth were somehow equivalent. For Socrates, truth stood on its own. I mean, once arrived at, it didn't depend on authority, it didn't depend on mythology, it didn't depend on wealth, it didn't depend on patriotism. Truth was something that Socrates felt could be discovered through painstaking examination and arrived at through a kind of ethical progress of disagreement and debate. He could be a kind of guy that might really irritate you if you didn't want to be questioned, if you just wanted people to carry out what you felt was the best course of action. There was Socrates constantly questioning, asking you to defend your ideas at the very level of principle and logic. Yeah, so such a method was seen as confrontational, especially with authorities who figured they already possessed knowledge and truth. So, bug off, Socrates. Socrates was a public figure because he engaged his listeners in the most public place, the agora. And in this sense, he has a bit in common, I think you could say, with Confucius, because remember, it was also the idea of Confucius, the near contemporary of Socrates, that you could arrive at a more ethical, principled understanding of behavior, whether it be the governance of a family, that is, the authority of a father, or that of a magistrate ruling over a community. In both cases, said Confucius, certain basic ethical principles must be observed for any government to be considered good government. And that's really what Socrates was after. What he would have said was good government. And by good government, he meant government which best upheld the principles of justice. When he questioned the sons of wealthy Athenians about their city's commitment to justice, he hit a raw nerve with powerful Athenians. Powerful Athenians who were nervous about Socrates' influence, you might say, on the young minds of Athens. One of those he questioned, Thrasymachus, for example, taunted Socrates by claiming that justice was nothing more than whatever the rich and powerful say it is. A kind of cynical view, you might say, of justice. Was Thrasymachus right? Was justice just a smoke screen for the rich and the powerful? He who can afford the best lawyers gets the most justice? Well, I think we can kind of relate to that, right? Because, these are issues we deal with on our own day. But Socrates wouldn't let it go there. He thought that was too lazy. He thought that was too dangerous, ultimately, to simply have a kind of fatalism which turned over to the wealthy and the powerful all responsibility for defining what justice is. He challenges his critics by questioning their arrogant assumptions. He says they are confusing justice with what is merely legal, that is, confusing what is superficial with what is true at its base. Thus, he agrees that laws may often be an expression of selfish interests, let's say what the wealthy want or the powerful want. Yeah, if they can get enough critical mass together, they may pass laws that only express their interests, especially if those who pass them are not fully committed to justice. That's most likely to be the case. Now, when he would say things like this, it was easy to assume he meant, for example, those who were then the current rulers of Athens, who had suppressed democracy in time of war in the name of patriotism. But it was clear from his questioning of Thrasymachus that Socrates felt that was not a sufficient basis for understanding what is justice. If the wealthy or the powerful passed a law that guarded their interests, that's not saying, therefore, that that law was just if it didn't likewise protect the interests of everybody else. Justice, he says, Socrates says, is that which is valuable for its own sake, and not because it benefits one particular party or interest. In other words, something was inherently just or not because it favored this or that party, this or that interest, but because it was in and of itself simply the right thing. In effect, Socrates was accusing the leaders of Athens of pursuing a costly and expensive war that served their interests, but not that of their fellow Athenians. I mean, among other things, wars cause disruption, not only loss of life for those Athenians who went off to fight the wars, but even for those living back home in Athens, where food supplies might be disrupted, regular commerce and business interrupted as well, creating shortages and hardships on the city. In other words, everyone seems to suffer in a war like the Peloponnesian War. Now, the various civic leaders of Athens will warn against Socrates and his influence by saying that he's in effect subverting the patriotic duty of the Athenians, especially the Athenian young, who were most expected to march off to war as soldiers. By engaging them in these fundamental, searching, probing questions of governance and justice and right and wrong, fairness and these fundamental ethical principles, they think he's doing a lot of damage to the Athenian war effort. Ultimately, because he refuses to stop doing it, warning Socrates to stay away from the agora, but he's dogged, he's stubborn, he's persistent. And after a time, they decide to put an end to it a different way. And for this, Socrates will be brought up on charges of treason. Found guilty of corrupting the morals of the youth, it is said, Socrates will face the ultimate punishment. Having been judged guilty of treason, he will be sentenced to death. Corrupting the youth of Athens and dishonoring the gods. Let's think about this for a second. Corrupting the youth of Athens. Well, yeah, he wasn't telling young men not to fight in the Peloponnesian War, but he was questioning what he thought were their casual and arrogant assumptions about why they should fight in any war and why, therefore, Athenian democracy should be short-circuited by the wealthy and militarily powerful on behalf of a war. Dishonoring the gods? Well, you got to stretch a little bit to get that one, but think about it here. Socrates is claiming no particular authority of his own for his ideas. Remember, human reason was the tool potentially of anyone to arrive at truth and morality. But he wasn't appealing to the patriotic gods of Athens either, was he? And so it was easy enough for his enemies, his detractors, to kind of finagle an extra charge there against him, dishonoring the gods. And in effect, it reminds me, if you've seen the TV show American Gods or read the book American Gods, gods can be metaphorical, gods can be technological. We live in an age in which we say, for example, that maybe the silicon chip has become a kind of god of American daily life, and our smartphones and our computers and electronic devices that seem to rule our lives. Technology has become like a god. Well, the god of Athens then was the interest of the Peloponnesian War, that is, of the powerful, moneyed, and military interests of the war. And by invoking a kind of patriotic duty or obligation to follow that, they were saying that, in effect, Socrates, by denying it, or at least questioning it, right, that by at least questioning that directive, was somehow denying the gods of Athens their just honor in the victory in the Peloponnesian War. Now, look, if this reminds you of other instances where war eclipses normal civic liberties or other processes of democratic government, then you're not crazy, right? Whether in the United States it's looking at civil disobedience, say during any number of wars, whether it's Henry David Thoreau going to jail rather than paying taxes, which he said would support the war with Mexico in the 1840s, or Eugene V. Debs questioning the basis for war during World War I and being sentenced to federal prison, or protesters during the Vietnam War calling on the government to bring the troops home. In each and every of those cases where you see wartime clash with American civil liberties and the government taking it upon itself to either imprison or to beat back what it considers to be unpatriotic wartime protest. And yet, like ancient Athens, the United States is built on this notion of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, right of peaceful protest and that sort of thing. So what's exposed here is a kind of tension between that more liberating ethic of speech and expression, the very thing that Socrates took advantage of, and it's sort of its opposite, that kind of repressive or oppressive, claim of patriotic obedience. Well, in the end, convicted of treason, Socrates was faced with execution by poison, that is, drinking the poison hemlock. He had his allies, he had his friends who came to him, according to Plato, and offered him a way of escape. He would have to leave the city-state, but he could live and avoid the sentence of execution. But here, Socrates held firm. He said it would not be just for those living under the protection and privilege of the laws of the city to simply make them a convenience or an inconvenience and leave them whenever a particular interest dictated. He said, in other words, he would have to take the poison. This painting, The Death of Socrates, a famous painting from a much later period, shows the philosopher drinking the poison hemlock. Socrates refused offers, as I say, from friends to escape sentence by running away from Athens, claiming that the dictates of justice required he accept the sentence. As a result, not only does Socrates follow through on his execution, but as a result, the Peloponnesian War had effectively usurped the processes of democracy and given way to a powerful elite now who are basically calling all the shots. Okay, so that's the end of the second half of part 4, our lecture on gods